Envoy Ren stood at the observation deck of the diplomatic vessel and watched the blue planet turn below him. 41 species. 41 surrenders. He had brokered every single one, and every single one had followed the same pattern. Shock, denial, frantic communication between fractured governments, and then the quiet, defeated transmission of compliance. Average response time: 31 hours. He had a speech template saved. He just changed the species name each time. He pressed his upper hands together and watched the broadcast go out. The message hit every frequency on Earth simultaneously. Every language. Every channel. Television, radio, satellite, submarine cable. The Galactic Consensus had been doing this long enough to know how to make a species listen. The terms were simple. Disarm all military forces. Surrender governance to consensus oversight. Hand over all fissile material. Accept developmental guidance for a period of no less than 300 years. Non-compliance would trigger pacification. 72 hours. Ren turned from the window and walked back to his quarters. He poured himself a drink, a thin, sweet liquid from his homeworld that he allowed himself after every successful integration. He drank it early sometimes. He was that confident. On the bridge, Fleet Admiral Kale ran his standard pre-compliance projections. The numbers came back clean. 94.6% probability of full surrender within 48 hours. Earth species was fractious, tribal, divided into nearly 200 separate governance structures that couldn't agree on atmospheric temperature measurements. They had nuclear weapons, yes, but nothing orbital. Nothing that could touch the fleet. Kale had parked 600 warships in high orbit like a man parking his car in an empty lot. He didn't expect to use them. His tactical adjutant, Losh, filed the projections without comment. Losh was new. Eager. He trusted the models the way young officers always trusted models. Completely, because he'd never seen one fail. 12,000 kilometers below, in a grey conference room in New York, Lieutenant General Do-yoon sat in a folding chair and watched the world lose its mind. The UN Security Council chamber had turned into something between a funeral and a bar fight. Delegates screamed. Some cried. The French ambassador kept repeating the same phrase in 3 languages like a broken clock. The American delegation had gone quiet, which was worse. Do-yoon had seen that kind of quiet before. It was the silence of people making phone calls they didn't want anyone to hear. He sat in a side room with the Korean delegation. A cigarette rested between his fingers. Unlit. He'd quit 6 years ago. The cigarette didn't know that. He made his own calls. Quiet ones. To a research facility in Daejeon. To a bunker in the mountains of Gangwon province that didn't appear on any map. To a 19-year-old signals analyst named Sun Woo who picked up on the first ring and said nothing, just waited. Do-yoon spoke for 40 seconds. Then he hung up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The people he called were the kind of people who had been waiting for this call without knowing they were waiting for it. 8 months ago, a consensus probe had crashed in the East Sea. The official story was a meteorite. The unofficial story was a locked room in Daejeon where a physicist named Taiho had been taking the thing apart like a child with a music box, except the music box was built by a civilization 10,000 years older than his. Nobody told the consensus about the probe. That was the thing about humans that didn't show up in any consensus model. They were fractious, yes. Tribal, yes. They couldn't agree on temperature scales. But they could agree, without discussion, without treaty, without a single formal negotiation, on one thing. You don't show the stranger everything you have. Hours passed. The Security Council argued. World leaders made televised addresses. Some prayed. Some postured. Military forces went on high alert in 40 countries. Satellites repositioned. Submarines went deep and went silent. Do-yoon watched all of it from his folding chair. The cigarette was still unlit. He rolled it between his fingers like a rosary bead. At our 40, a coalition formed. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that held press conferences. The quiet kind. The kind that moved through encrypted backchannels and secure phone lines and, when those weren't safe enough, through physical couriers carrying handwritten notes. Do-yoon's fingerprints were on most of those notes. Not literally. He wore gloves. At our 47, Earth responded. The transmission was broadcast on every frequency, mirroring the consensus's own method. Every nation's flag, all 193 of them, arranged in a single image. Beneath them, one word, translated into consensus trade language. No. Ren was in his quarters when it came through. He set down his drink. He read it twice. He read it a third time because the word was so short he thought the translation might be incomplete. It was not incomplete. He closed the acceptance speech template. He'd had it open for 47 hours. He reached instead for a file he'd never opened in his career, post-refusal contingency. It was a thin file. Almost empty. 2 pages of vague guidelines written by someone who clearly never expected them to be needed. On the bridge, Losh pulled up the response on the main display. Cale stared at it. The flags. The word. That's it. Cale said. That's it, Losh confirmed. Cale exhaled through his lower vents. A long, slow sound. He pressed the fleet-wide channel and began issuing pacification orders. Standard formation. Standard deployment. The same playbook they'd used for 600 years. In his quarters, Ren poured his drink back into the bottle. He stood at the observation window and watched the blue planet turn. Something sat wrong in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Something smaller and worse. A hairline crack in a certainty he'd carried for 6 centuries. He pressed his upper hands against the glass. The planet looked the same as it had 72 hours ago. Blue. Green. White clouds. Small. He couldn't name what had changed. Below, in the side room, Do-yoon finally lit the cigarette. He inhaled once, deep, and let it out slow. Then he crushed it in an ashtray and stood up. He had lists to finish. Fleet Admiral Cale gave the order at dawn, Earth time. He chose dawn because the Psychological Operations Manual recommended it. Species in distress responded worse to attacks that interrupted their sleep cycles. It was a small cruelty, the kind built into doctrine so deeply that nobody thought of it as cruelty anymore. Just efficiency. 600 warships opened fire. Kinetic rods, dense tungsten alloy, no explosive charge needed at those velocities, dropped from orbit like the fingers of a god pressing thumbprints into wet clay. Military bases across 6 continents went dark in the first 90 seconds. Radar installations. Airfields. Naval ports. Missile silos. The consensus had mapped every military asset on the planet from orbit over the preceding 72 hours. Their targeting data was, by their standards, flawless. Cale watched the strike map update in real time. Red dots turning grey. Grey meant neutralized. He counted them the way a banker counts coins. Routine. Atmospheric drones, he said. Losh relayed the order. 12,000 suppression drones deployed from carrier vessels, dropping through the atmosphere in tight formations, spreading across the surface like seeds thrown from a hand. Their job was simple: patrol, surveil, and neutralize any remaining organized resistance. The drones carried pulse weapons that could disable vehicles, electronics, and nervous systems with equal ease. They were not designed to kill. They were designed to make resistance so painful and pointless that killing became unnecessary. This was not war. Cale was clear on this. This was pacification. War implied an opponent. Pacification implied a subject that hadn't yet accepted its situation. He expected the situation to resolve itself within 6 to 14 days. On day 1, it looked like he was right. Global communications went erratic. Power grids failed across large sections of North America, Europe, and East Asia. Civilian panic. Refugee columns. Fires that nobody came to put out. The surface of Earth looked, from orbit, exactly the way 41 other planets had looked at this stage. Broken. Quiet. Compliant. Cale almost relaxed. He shouldn't have. 300 meters below a mountain in Gangwon Province, South Korea, a woman named Yuna wiped grease from her face with the back of her hand and tightened a coupling bolt with a wrench that was never meant for this kind of work. The wrench was for bridge construction. The thing she was building was not a bridge. It was a directed energy weapon. Taiho's design. Based on the components his team had pulled from the consensus probe that had crashed in the East Sea 8 months ago. The physics were alien. The engineering was human. Yuna had welded the frame together from steel plating meant for road barriers, wired the power system using repurposed submarine battery cells, and solved the cooling problem with a method that involved, among other things, for industrial refrigeration unit stolen from a seafood processing plant in Sokcho. It was ugly. It looked like something a desperate person had built in a cave. It worked. Yuna patted the machine's frame the way a person pats a horse. "Don't embarrass me," she said to it. 2 levels above her, Taiho was on his 7th straight day without sleep. His eyes had the glazed, feverish look of a man who had passed through exhaustion and come out the other side into something sharper and more dangerous. He was on a conference call with 14 laboratories across 9 countries. The call was not running through satellite. Not through internet. Sun Wu, the 19-year-old signals analyst who had no business being this good at anything, had routed the entire network through physical submarine cables and fiber optic relays that the consensus couldn't detect because the consensus wasn't looking for them. Their surveillance model assumed that destroying satellite infrastructure would collapse human communication. The model assumed wrong. Humans had been talking through cables buried under oceans for 150 years. Old technology. Stupid technology. The kind of technology that a Tier 9 species used before it grew up. Sun Wu had turned that stupidity into a weapon. Above the clouds, Hannah pulled her fighter jet into a climb so steep that the airframe groaned like a living thing. Her call sign was Kachi, magpie, because she was loud, fast, and took things that didn't belong to her. Today, the thing that didn't belong to her was going to be a consensus atmospheric drone. She'd launched from a camouflage strip in the mountains with 3 other pilots. One of them, Jahoon, had been her wingman since flight school. He had a picture of his daughter taped to his instrument panel. Hannah had told him once to take it down because it was unprofessional. He'd told her to mind her own business. She'd laughed. Jahoon died in the first 30 seconds. A pulse burst from the drone caught his engine housing. His jet didn't explode. It just stopped flying. It fell like a stone dropped from a table, and Hannah watched it go. 10 seconds later, she killed the drone. 2 missiles. One to strip the shielding, one to breach the core. The drone broke apart in a shower of sparks that looked, from a distance, almost beautiful. She didn't watch it fall. She was already calling for recovery teams. The wreckage was worth more than the kill. On the ground, soldiers dragged pieces of the drone out of a rice paddy while farmers watched from the edges of their fields. Within 4 hours, the drone's shield generator was on a table in Taiho's lab. He had it disassembled by midnight. By morning, he understood it. I can break this, he told Do-yoon over the cable network. How long? I already did. Kale noticed the first problem on day 3. His suppression drones were disappearing. Not in large numbers. 1 here. 2 there. Small losses, within acceptable parameters. But the pattern was wrong. The losses weren't random. They were clustered around specific geographic zones. Mountain ranges, dense forests, urban ruins. Places where the terrain was difficult and the humans had home advantage. They're hunting the drones, Losh said, pulling up a map. The loss clusters formed a pattern. Each cluster centered on a zone where, days later, human resistance would appear using weapons that shouldn't exist on this planet. Energy weapons. Plasma-adjacent systems. Crude. Ugly. Effective. They were learning from the wreckage. Kale doubled the orbital bombardment. More rods. More targets. Deeper bunkers cracked open. Cities that had already been hit got hit again. This is still pacification, he said to his bridge crew. Nobody answered. Losh looked at his console. The numbers were still within acceptable range. But the curve, the rate at which human resistance should have been declining, had flattened. It wasn't going down anymore. It was going up. On day 5, the first consensus ground unit deployed in Southeast Asia. 300 soldiers. Heavy armor. Pulse weaponry. They expected scattered civilians and maybe a few fighters with primitive guns. They walked into a kill zone designed by people who had been studying their tactics for 5 days straight. Directed energy weapons opened up from 3 directions. The consensus armor held for 11 seconds. Then it didn't. The entire unit was gone in 4 minutes. Every soldier. Every vehicle. Humans swept the site clean within an hour. Took the bodies. Took the weapons. Took everything. Kale received the report in silence. They took the bodies, Losh said quietly. Kale looked at him. They took the bodies, Losh repeated. Every other species leaves the dead. These ones took them. They're studying our biology. Kale said nothing for a long time. Then he opened the fleet-wide channel and ordered another bombardment. This was still pacification. He said it once more, to no one in particular. The bridge was very quiet. Archivist Moll had written Earth Species File 11 months ago. She remembered it clearly because it had been the easiest assessment of her career. A quick job. Almost boring. The planet had showed up on long-range surveys as a standard pre-cooperative world, one dominant species, fractured into competing governance structures, burning fossil carbon for energy, launching crude chemical rockets into low orbit and calling it a space program. She had assigned it Tier 9 without hesitation. Tier 9 meant, not a threat. Not interesting. Not worth thinking about twice. She was now thinking about it for the 5th time in 9 days, and each time the picture got worse. Her office aboard the Consensus Archive vessel was a circular room lined with data screens. Every screen showed Earth. Casualty reports. Equipment loss logs. Communication intercepts. Resistance activity maps. She had cleared her entire schedule. Every other species file in her queue, and there were dozens, sat untouched. Earth had eaten her whole workload alive. She pulled up her original assessment and read her own words. Fractious. Tribal. Technologically adolescent. Negligible resistance window. Estimated 6 to 14 days before total infrastructure collapse. Day 9. She highlighted the words negligible resistance window and deleted them. The data that replaced them was the kind of data that made archivists drink. Item 1. Consensus drone shielding operated on a rotating frequency modulation that had never been cracked by any species during active conflict. The fastest previous crack had been by the Venn Coalition, a Tier 3 civilization with 2 centuries of directed energy research. They had done it in 19 days. Humans did it in 72 hours. Not a team of humans. One physicist in a mountain laboratory running on caffeine and spite, with a combat engineer handing him tools and a 19-year-old feeding him stolen consensus data through a submarine cable. Item 2. That 19-year-old. Moll didn't know his name. She knew his work. One person, her analysts insisted, the signature was consistent, had penetrated a secondary consensus fleet communication relay 9 days into the conflict. Not a brute force attack. Not a known exploit. The attacker had found a flaw in the authentication protocol that Moll's own technical staff hadn't known existed. He had inserted false telemetry, fake fleet positions, phantom ship movements, ghost signals, for 11 hours before anyone noticed. 11 hours during which Kale's tactical planning had been based on information that a teenager had made up. Losh had been the one to catch it. He told Moll privately that the false data had been beautiful. That it had mimicked real consensus communication patterns so closely that the detection algorithms hadn't flagged it. The attacker had studied their communication style and learned to speak it. In 9 days. Item 3. Human ground forces were not behaving like a species under pacification. Moll had seen dozens of species resist. Resistance always followed the same arc, fierce at first, then fragmented, then desperate, then silent. Humans had skipped every stage after the first one. They weren't fragmenting. They weren't getting desperate. They were doing something that Moll had never seen in her career and had no category for. They were trading space for information. Every engagement followed the same pattern. Human forces would meet consensus troops, fight long enough to inflict damage and recover equipment, then fall back. Not retreat. Fall back. The difference was critical. Retreating forces lost cohesion. Falling back forces maintained it. They pulled away in order, carrying wreckage, carrying their own dead, carrying every piece of consensus technology they could drag. And then, days later, sometimes hours later, they would appear again. With better weapons. With adapted tactics. With countermeasures to things the consensus had used in the previous engagement. They learned faster than they died. Moll typed those words into the species file and stared at them. Then she submitted a formal reclassification request. Tier 4. Active threat. Requires fleet-level engagement protocols. The Galactic Council rejected it within an hour. The rejection note said her assessment was alarmist and inconsistent with observed capabilities of a Tier 9 civilization. The note was signed by 3 council members who had not read a single engagement report from the surface. Moll saved the rejection. She saved everything now. For the record. In the mountain bunker in Gangwon Province, Sun Woo sat cross-legged on a cot surrounded by equipment that hadn't been designed to work together and was working together anyway. His fingers moved across 3 separate keyboards. His eyes tracked data on 4 screens. A cup of instant ramen sat beside him, cold, half-eaten, forgotten. He hadn't slept in 6 days. His body had passed through tired and come out somewhere else, a state that felt like floating 2 inches above his own skull, watching his hands work from a slight distance. He knew this was bad. He knew he should sleep. He also knew that the consensus primary command network used a layered encryption system that rotated on a 14-hour cycle, and he had found a seam in the 4th layer that only existed for 90 seconds during each rotation, and if he could thread a passive listener through that seam, he could read every order Kale issued in real time. He could not do this if he was sleeping. The bunker door opened. Do-yoon walked in carrying a plastic bag. He set it on the table next to Sunwoo's dead ramen. Inside the bag, rice, kimchi jjigae in a sealed container still warm, 2 bottles of water, and a pair of clean socks. Sunwoo looked at the socks. "Your mother called the command office," Do-yoon said. "She wanted to know if you were eating." Sunwoo opened the kimchi jjigae. The smell filled the bunker. He ate 3 bites so fast he almost choked. Do-yoon sat on the edge of the cot. He said nothing for a full minute. He watched the screens. He didn't understand most of what they showed, but he understood the shape of it. A man building a door into a locked room. How long until you can get into their primary command network? Do-yoon asked.
Impossible.
Sunwoo chewed. Swallowed. Maybe Thursday. Do-yoon nodded like Thursday was fine. 2 levels below, Yuna was building her 4th directed energy weapon. She had named the first 3. Number 1 was better, after the ocean, because the power cells came from submarine batteries. Number 2 was Dambai, after a cat she had as a child, because it was small and mean and broke things bigger than itself. Number 3 was Halmei, after her grandmother, because it was old technology held together with stubbornness and love. Number 4 she hadn't named yet. She was still welding the frame. Sparks fell around her like orange rain. She talked to the machine while she worked. "Hold still." I said, "Hold still. You're worse than Dambai." Taiho came down the stairs carrying a tablet. He looked like a man who had been electrocuted slowly over the course of 10 days. His hair pointed in 4 directions. His shirt was buttoned wrong. "The coalition labs confirmed," he said. 14 countries. 22 weapons ready. 6 more by end of week. Yuna didn't look up from her weld. "Will they reach orbit?" "They'll reach orbit." She set down the welding torch. She looked at him. Taiho's eyes were bloodshot and too bright and completely steady. "You're sure?" she said. Not a question. "The probe we pulled from the East Sea used a focusing array that amplifies coherent light by a factor of 9,000. I rebuilt it with better materials. Theirs was elegant. Ours is not elegant. Ours hits harder." Yuna picked up the torch. "Good. Elegant is for people who aren't angry." 3 days later, Hannah flew her 6th sortie. She had lost 4 pilots since the first day. She didn't count Jahoon separately anymore. She couldn't. If she counted Jahoon separately, she would have to think about the picture of his daughter taped to the instrument panel of a jet that was now scattered across a mountainside, and she could not think about that and also fly. She flew. Below her, in a valley rigged with Taiho's weapon, number 2, the one Yuna called Dambai, a consensus corvette hung in low orbit. Small ship. Scout class. Fast. Its shields were the same rotating frequency type that Taiho had cracked on day 3. The weapon fired. A beam of light so concentrated it was almost invisible, just a thin white line drawn from the mountaintop to the sky. It hit the corvette's lateral hull and punched through it the way a nail punches through wet paper. The corvette didn't explode. It just stopped. Lights out. Engines dead. It drifted sideways, slow, like a fish turning belly up. Hannah watched from her cockpit. She didn't cheer. Below her, the recovery teams were already moving. On the consensus bridge, Losh pulled up the damage report. He turned to Kale. Kale's face was very still. "They hit a corvette," Losh said. "From the surface. With a ground-based weapon. That's not possible for a Tier 9 species." Losh looked at his screen. Looked at Kale. Said nothing. The screen said it for him. That night, Ren composed a private message to the Galactic Council. He wrote it 3 times. The final version was 1 sentence. Recommend immediate reclassification. This species does not behave within modeled parameters. The Council responded within 2 hours. Continue pacification. Increase force allocation. Ren read the response twice. He saved a personal copy. He opened the file he had started keeping, private, encrypted, outside official channels, and added the council's message to it. He titled the file Record. He didn't know yet what it was a record of, but something in his chest, that hairline crack from day one, told him he would need it. The Galactic Council chamber was a half-sphere carved from white stone on a station orbiting a star that had no name, only a number. The chamber seated 412 representatives from 309 species. It had been built for calm deliberation, for measured voices discussing trade routes and resource allocation and the slow, boring business of running a galaxy. Today it sounded like a cage full of animals who had just noticed the door was open. Archivist Moll stood at the center podium. She was small for her species, barely 2 meters, and the podium had been designed for someone larger. She had to stretch to reach the data controls. This should have made her look foolish. It did not. The numbers on the screen behind her did the talking, and the numbers were not foolish. The numbers were terrifying. She began with her original assessment. Tier 9. Pre-cooperative. Fractious. She let the words hang in the air so the chamber could taste how wrong they were. Then she showed them what had happened since. Slide 1. Earth had formed a unified military command structure within 72 hours of first contact. Her original model had predicted this would take years, if it happened at all. The model cited historical data, 2 world wars, a Cold War, 40 years of nuclear standoff between rival nations. Humans couldn't cooperate. That was the whole point of being Tier 9. The model was wrong. Humans couldn't cooperate with each other. They cooperated very well against something else. Slide 2. Reverse-engineered consensus technology. Not copies. Moll paused on this word. She said it again. Not copies. The weapons Earth was now fielding were based on consensus designs but modified. Lighter. Faster. In several cases, more powerful. A consensus corvette had been destroyed by a ground-based weapon built from probe wreckage and submarine batteries by a combat engineer whose previous job had been building roads. The chamber was quiet. Slide 3. Casualties. Moll showed this one because she had to, and she hated it. Earth's losses were enormous. Tens of millions dead. Cities gone. Entire regions reduced to ash and rubble. Infrastructure destroyed on a scale that would take decades to rebuild. By every standard metric, Earth was a broken world. And yet, she showed the next line on the graph. Resistance activity. It should have been falling. On every other world, at this level of casualties, resistance collapsed. The population broke. The will broke. The math was simple. You cannot fight when you have nothing left to fight with. The line was going up. Not steady. Not gradual. The line bent upward like something pulled by a force that Moll could not put a number on. Recruitment was increasing. Production was increasing. New weapons were appearing faster than the consensus could catalog them. Humans were not breaking. Humans were compounding. Moll said the word and let the silence carry it. Compounding. The way interest compounds. The way a fire compounds. The more they lost, the more they built. The more they were hit, the harder they hit back. It was not logical. It was not modeled. It was not something Moll had ever seen in 3 centuries of species assessment. She submitted her reclassification. Tier 1. Existential consideration. The chamber erupted. Representatives stood. Some shouted. The delegate from the Ren Compact, no relation to the envoy, called the assessment hysterical. The delegate from the Voss hegemony demanded Moll's removal from the archive staff. Tier 1 had only been assigned twice in consensus history. Once to the founders themselves. Once to a species that had nearly destroyed an entire galactic arm before being stopped. Moll stood at the podium and waited. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with people who were frightened was like arguing with weather. You waited for it to pass and then you showed them the data again. Kale addressed the chamber via relay from his flagship. His image filled the secondary screen, broad, armored, his face the color of old iron. He spoke with the clipped precision of a man who had stopped pretending this was pacification 2 days ago and hadn't told anyone. His recommendation was simple. Full extermination order. Destroy the surface. Sterilize the biosphere. Remove the species entirely before it reached technological parity with the consensus fleet. My timeline estimate for parity, Kale said, is 18 months. The chamber went silent. Not the angry silence from before. A different kind. The kind that comes when a room full of powerful people realizes, all at the same moment, that the situation is no longer inside their control. Kale continued. If we allow this species another 18 months, they will be able to reach us. Not just defend. Reach. They are not building a shield. They are building a fist. Moll watched the faces in the chamber. She saw the fear move through them like a wave through water. She felt no satisfaction. She had been right, and being right felt like nothing. 12,000 kilometers below, in a bunker that smelled like soda and cold rice, Do-yoon stood in front of a screen showing the position of every consensus vessel in Earth orbit. The data was real-time. Sun Woo had cracked the primary command network on a Wednesday. He had told Do-yoon it would be Thursday. He was eating a rice ball in the corner, finally, and his hands were shaking, not from fear but from the specific tremor that comes after 6 days of no sleep followed by the single greatest act of electronic warfare in human history. Do-yoon looked at the screen. 600 warships.
Orbital platforms.
Carrier vessels. Drone bays. The full weight of a galactic civilization parked above his planet like a boot over an anthill. He turned to the room. Coalition commanders from 11 countries sat at a long table. Some in uniform. Some not. A Brazilian general with bandages on both hands. A Norwegian signals officer who had walked 200 kilometers through bombed-out terrain to reach a working relay station. A Japanese engineer who had lost her entire lab team on day 2 and had rebuilt the lab alone in a basement. These were not people who needed speeches. Do-yoon's briefing was 2 sentences. We take their eyes out. Then we take the conversation to them. He laid out the operation. 9 simultaneous strikes on consensus orbital platforms using directed energy weapons built by Taiho's coalition. 22 weapons across 14 countries. Yuna had built 7 of them personally. She had named each one. Hannah would lead the aerospace component. 52 pilots flying modified jets carrying weapons that hadn't existed 3 months ago. Their job was not to fight the fleet. Their job was to protect the ground weapons long enough for them to fire. Fly cover. Draw attention. Survive if possible. Hannah sat in the briefing room and listened. Her face was still. She had lost 11 pilots in the weeks since the invasion began. She knew their names. She knew their families. She carried those names the way a person carries a stone in each pocket. Always there, always heavy, pressing down with every step. She didn't speak during the briefing. When it ended, she stood, put on her helmet, and walked to her jet. The strike launched at 0400 local time. 22 beams of light, thin and white and almost beautiful, rose from 14 countries and reached for the sky. 5 orbital platforms died. The beams hit them and they broke apart in silence. No sound in vacuum, just light and debris spreading outward like slow flowers. 2 more platforms took damage, listing sideways, bleeding atmosphere. 2 shots missed. Targeting errors. Human technology was good. It was not perfect. Not yet. Hannah flew cover over the weapon site in Gangwon province. 3 consensus interceptors came for her. She killed 2. The 3rd clipped her wing. Her jet shuddered. Alarms screamed. She held it together with her hands and her teeth and something deeper than training, something that lived in the part of her brain that refused to stop. She landed. Barely. The jet scraped across the camouflage strip and came to rest at an angle that shouldn't have been survivable. She climbed out. She took off her helmet. She sat on the tarmac. 4 minutes. She sat for 4 minutes without moving. Ground crew stood at a distance and watched. Nobody approached. They knew what 4 minutes of silence cost. Then she stood up. She asked for another jet. With orbital superiority broken, not destroyed, not yet, but cracked, fractured, no longer absolute, Earth transmitted. Not to Kale's fleet. Directly to the Galactic Council. On the Council's own secure frequency. In fluent consensus trade language. The message appeared on every screen in the chamber. 412 representatives read it at the same time. You came to our home. You burned our cities. You killed our people. We have taken your weapons and made them better. We are not asking for peace. We are telling you this is over. Leave. You will not be followed. You will not be forgiven. But you will be allowed to go. This offer expires. No expiration time given. Ren read the message from his quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel. He read it standing up. He read it again. He looked at the final line. This offer expires.
No timestamp. No deadline.
Just the two words, hanging open like a mouth. He understood. The absence of a deadline was the deadline. It meant, we could change our mind at any time, and you will not know when. He had no template for this. In the council chamber, 412 representatives sat in silence. On the main screen, Earth's message glowed in white text against a dark background. On the secondary screen, Kale's iron face waited for orders. Nobody spoke. Moll stood at the podium. She looked at the message. She looked at the chamber. She said nothing. The data had done its work. There was nothing left to add. The silence in the chamber was the loudest sound in the galaxy. Kale wanted to fight. He said so plainly, his iron face filling the secondary screen in the council chamber, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had spent his entire career solving problems by hitting them harder. Increase the fleet. Triple the bombardment. Crack the planet open to its mantle if necessary. The species was dangerous. The species would only become more dangerous. The math was simple. Kill them now or fight them later on their terms. The council listened. Then Moll showed them her projections. She had run the models 17 times. She had changed the variables, adjusted the assumptions, stress-tested every input. The results came back the same way every time, and every time they made her stomach turn. Scenario 1. Continue pacification at current force levels. Result: human technological parity with consensus fleet weapons within 14 months. Full fleet parity within 20. At that point, the conflict would shift from suppression to open war against an opponent that had spent 20 months studying consensus tactics, technology, and communication protocols from the inside. An opponent that had learned the consensus's own language. That was reading Kale's orders in real time. That had taken consensus weapons apart and put them back together better. Moll didn't editorialize. She let the numbers sit. Scenario 2. Full extermination. Kale's recommendation. Destroy 90% of the surface. Sterilize major population centers. Eliminate industrial capacity. The model showed this would work. For approximately 1 generation. The remaining 10% of humans, and there would be a remaining 10%, because this species built shelters the way other species built temples, deep and redundant and hidden, would survive. They would rebuild. They would carry with them every piece of consensus technology they had captured, every scrap of data Sun Wu had pulled from the command network, every lesson learned from every engagement. And they would be angry. Not the hot, short anger that burns out. The cold kind. The kind that gets passed down. The kind that builds ships. Moll's model estimated that the surviving population would achieve offensive interstellar capability within 1 generation. 30 to 40 years. The confidence interval on this estimate was narrow. Disturbingly narrow. The model had no uncertainty because the data left no room for it. She showed one final slide. A single line of text. There is no scenario in which the species is defeated and does not eventually reach us. The chamber sat with that sentence for a long time. Kale argued. He argued with the precision of a military mind that could not accept a problem without a military solution. He cited doctrine. He cited precedent. He cited 600 years of successful pacification. The delegate from the Voss hegemony, the same one who had called Moll's assessment hysterical, stood and asked a quiet question. Fleet Admiral. In 600 years of pacification, has any species ever transmitted a message to this chamber on our own secure frequency, in our own language, using encryption they broke themselves? Kale did not answer. The vote was called. Withdrawal. Unanimous except for Kale, who voted to continue and was, in the same session, formally stripped of command. He took the decision in silence. His face on the screen didn't change. He closed the channel without a word, and his image vanished from the secondary display like a light switched off. Ren was assigned to deliver the withdrawal notice. He sat in his quarters for 3 hours before he began writing. 41 species. 41 surrender acceptances. Each one had taken him less than an hour. Fill in the species name, adjust the territorial boundaries, attach the standard governance transition protocols. Administrative work. Clerical. This was not a surrender acceptance. This was something else. The consensus was not accepting Earth surrender. Earth had not surrendered. Earth had won. And the consensus was leaving. There was no template for this because it had never happened. Ren wrote the notice himself. Word by word. He wrote it and deleted it and wrote it again. The language had to be precise. Not because precision mattered legally, the consensus could phrase it however they wanted, but because Ren understood, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, that this document would be read for a very long time. By his own people. By humans. By every species in the consensus who would hear about what happened here and wonder what it meant. He chose his words carefully. He acknowledged the cessation of hostilities. He confirmed the withdrawal of all consensus military assets from the Sol system. He included a non-engagement clause. The consensus would not return to Sol space without invitation. He did not apologize. He was not authorized to apologize, and he was not sure an apology would be accepted. He transmitted the notice at midday, Earth time. Then he stood at his observation window and watched the fleet begin to move. 600 warships. Carrier vessels. Drone bays. The full weight of a galactic civilization, pulling away from the blue planet like a hand lifting from a table. Below, Do-Yoon received the notice in the bunker. He read it on a screen while Sun-Woo sat beside him, translating in real time, his voice flat and hoarse from weeks of exhaustion. Sun-Woo read the non-engagement clause twice to make sure he had it right. He did. Do-Yoon set the tablet down. He reached into his jacket pocket and found his cigarette. The same one. He'd been carrying it for weeks. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back in his pocket. He didn't smile. There was nothing to smile about. The war was over. The math was simple. They had won. But math didn't account for the cities that were gone. For the millions who were dead. For the pilots Hannah had lost. For the labs Taiho's colleagues had died in. For the families that Sun-Woo's submarine cables had connected to nothing because there was no one left on the other end. Do-Yoon picked up a phone and made calls. The same way he'd started. Quiet. Steady. One at a time. In the mountain facility in Gangwon province, Yuna was running maintenance on weapon number 4. She had finally named it. Sunshin. After her grandmother's dog. A fat, slow, ancient dog that had outlived every prediction the vet had ever made, that had refused to die on any schedule but its own. It seemed right. She was tightening a coupling bolt when the news came through on the facility's comm system. A calm voice. Official. The words cessation of hostilities and confirmed withdrawal spoken in the tone of someone reading a weather report. Yuna set down her wrench. She sat on the concrete floor next to Sunshin's steel frame. She put her hand on the machine's side. The metal was cold. She left her hand there anyway. She cried. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just tears running down a face that was still dirty with grease and solder dust, falling onto a uniform that hadn't been clean in weeks. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't know exactly what she was crying about. Relief, maybe. Or something older. Something that had been waiting behind the work and the welding and the naming of machines, waiting for a moment quiet enough to come through. She sat there for a long time. When she stood up, she picked up the wrench and went back to work. The weapon still needed maintenance. War or no war. Hannah was in the air when she heard. She was flying a patrol, unnecessary now, but she hadn't landed in 11 hours and she didn't want to. Landing meant stopping. Stopping meant thinking. She wasn't ready for that yet. She heard the words through her headset. She clicked the acknowledgement. She finished her patrol route. She landed the jet with the same precision she always used, every motion exact, every system shut down in order. She climbed out. She took off her helmet. She stood on the tarmac and looked at the sky. Somewhere up there, 600 warships were leaving. She couldn't see them. She couldn't see anything except sky, grey, overcast, ordinary, Korean sky. The same sky she'd been flying in since she was 22 years old. She turned and walked toward the barracks. She didn't look back at the sky. She had spent enough time up there. Aboard the diplomatic vessel, Ren opened his personal log. The file he'd been keeping, the one titled Record. He scrolled through it. Messages. Data. Timestamps. The whole arc of the conflict, documented in fragments. He began his final entry. He wrote about the 41 species. How each one had surrendered. How each one had followed the model. Shock, denial, fracture, compliance. How he had watched it happen so many times that he had stopped seeing the species as distinct from each other. They were all the same. They were all an equation with one answer. He wrote about Earth. About the word no transmitted at hour 47. About the Corvette that went dark. About the message that appeared on the Council's own screens in the Council's own language. About the vote. About Cale's face disappearing from a display. He wrote about classification. Species. Human.
Sol 3.
Previous classification. Tier 9. Pre-cooperative. Current classification. He paused. Tier 1 was what Moll had recommended. It was what the Council had reluctantly accepted. But Wren had spent 3 hours writing a withdrawal notice to a species that had beaten the consensus with submarine cables and stolen probe parts, and a physicist who hadn't slept and a combat engineer who named her weapons after dogs. Tier 1 didn't cover it. Tier 1 meant existential consideration. It meant be careful. Careful wasn't the right word. He typed, Tier 0, do not engage. He noted, for the record, that Tier 0 was a new designation. It had not existed before this entry. He had created it because nothing in the existing system described what he had witnessed. Then he added a personal note. He was not required to. He had never added one before, in 41 files. But this was not the 41st file. This was something else. In 600 years of service, I have watched 41 species surrender. I have never once watched a species look at the full force of the consensus and simply refuse. Not resist. Not negotiate. Refuse. As if the outcome was never in question for them, only its cost. And they paid it. Every day, they paid it. I watched them bury their dead and build weapons from the wreckage and send their young into the sky in machines held together with welding meant for bridges. I do not know what to call this. The closest word in our language translates, roughly, to insanity. He paused. He thought of the message. The final line. This offer expires. He typed one more sentence. I believe the humans have a better word for it. They call it spite. Wren saved the file. He closed his log. He stood at the observation window one last time and watched the blue planet shrink as the fleet pulled away. It looked small. It had always looked small. He knew better now. The fleet moved outward through the dark, and behind them, on a planet still burning in places, still broken in places, still counting its dead, a woman sat on a concrete floor next to a machine named after a dog, and a pilot walked away from the sky, and a boy who had cracked a galaxy's encryption ate cold rice with shaking hands, and a general carried an unsmoked cigarette in his jacket pocket like a promise he hadn't decided whether to keep. The planet turned. It did what it had always done. It kept going.